It started with a simple walk. Snoop Dogg was passing through a quiet neighborhood when he saw it, a vacant lot, forgotten, abandoned, surrounded by a broken fence and overgrown with weeds. For most people, it was just another piece of wasted land, another reminder of abandonment in a place that deserved better. But for Snoop, it was potential. He saw children playing in the streets with no safe place to go. He saw families struggling to get fresh food, depending on how little they could get. He saw a neighborhood that needed something real, something that would bring people together, something that would really make a difference. And that's when he made the decision. That land was not going to remain empty. It was about to become something bigger. A place where food would grow, where people would gather, where a community would come back to life. And no one, not even Snoop, was prepared for how much everything would change. The street was quiet, the kind of place most just walked by without a second thought. No bright advertisements, no fancy shops, just a neighborhood where people worked hard, took care of each other, and did the best they could with the little they had. But as Snoop Dogg was walking, something caught his attention. A vacant lot. Forgotten. Overgrown with weeds. Fenced with a rusty chain, its floor full of garbage, broken glass, and weeds growing out of control. For most, it was nothing. But for Snoop, it was something waiting to be transformed. The streets of the neighborhood stretched long and silent, full of stories that no one outside ever heard. The buildings remained with faded paint, windows covered with old curtains, front porches that were once full of life, now sitting in the silence. It was not a bad place, not in the way imagined by those who had never lived there. It was a place of survival, of resilience, of families doing the best they could with the little they had. But no matter how hard they tried, there were things this neighborhood just didn't have. There were no fresh produce markets. There were no green spaces. There were no places where children could run, where families could sit, where people could gather for no other reason than to be together. And at the center of all that, a wasteland that had been forgotten. The first time Snoop saw it, he didn't see what it was. He saw what could be. The land was surrounded by a rusty fence, its edges bending inward, as if she had already given up. The ground below was cracked, dry, covered with old soda cans, broken glass, and weeds that had struggled to make their way through the concrete. It had been there for years, abandoned, ignored, just another space that people passed through without thinking. But for Snoop, it was Earth. And the Earth was power. The Earth could be transformed. The Earth could feed people. And right now, this community needed something that could give them something back. Snoop had been to places where people had choices. Where fresh produce was just a few streets away, where there were parks in every neighborhood, where families could sit outside without feeling like they had nowhere to go. This was not one of those places. Here, families stretched every dollar. Mothers walked 4 miles to buy groceries, carrying heavier bags than they should have. Here, children played in the streets, not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to go. Here, the elderly would sit on the front porches, watching time go by, remembering when this neighborhood had more. And every day, they passed by that empty lot, not imagining that it could be something more than it already was. Because when you go too long without something, you stop imagining that you could have it. That night, Snoop sat in his car, looking at the terrain, thinking about everything he had seen. And then, a question hit him. Why not? Why couldn't this be something else? Why did this neighborhood have to go on without what others had in abundance? Why had no one taken this space and turned it into something that mattered? And the most important thing, why couldn't he do it? Once the idea was planted in his mind, he refused to leave. A garden. Not just a small piece of land with a few plants, but a real, thriving and growing space. A place where families could come to pick fresh vegetables. A place where children could learn that food doesn't just come from the supermarket. A place where elders could share their knowledge, where people could sit in the shade, where the community could gather, not out of necessity, but because they had a place that felt like theirs. It wasn't just about food. It was about dignity. Because when you give people a way to take care of themselves, when you put fresh food in their hands, when you turn an abandoned lot into a source of life, you're not just feeding them. It reminds them of their value. Snoop wasted no time. He made calls, not to the media, not to sponsors, not to people who would turn this into an advertising strategy. He called those who knew how to build something real. Gardeners, local activists, who had been working for years to bring fresh food to communities that had nothing. And when did he tell you about his plan? They didn't ask why. They just asked, when do we start? The news spread fast. The next morning, people showed up. Not only workers, families, children, the elderly, neighbors who have never spoken before. Some came with tools. Some came with nothing but their hands. Some just came to see if this was really happening, if someone was really going to change something, if this wasn't just another empty promise. And when they saw Snook standing there, sleeves rolled up, hands in the dirt, planting next to them, they knew. This wasn't just an idea. It was real. For years, the rusting fence had surrounded the land, keeping people out. But that day, it fell apart. Piece by piece, taken apart by the very people he once kept away. And when the last section fell, when the space finally opened up, something changed. The land no longer belonged to abandonment. He no longer belonged to the garbage, to the weeds, to the idea that nothing could grow there. It belonged to the people. In the beginning, it was just earth and determination. But then, the first seeds were planted. Tomatoes. Vegetables. Peppers. Fruits that would take years to grow, but when they did, they would feed generations. And with every seed, every shovel of dirt, every hand that sank into the ground, the neighborhood began to change. Not just in the way he looked, but in the way he felt. Because this wasn't just about food. It was about recovering something that had been lost. The months passed. The garden took shape. It was not just a place to pick vegetables, it was a place where people gathered, where conversations took place, where elders taught children how to plant, where neighbors who had never spoken before were now sharing meals together. It was proof that something good could come from a place that had been forgotten. And one day, while Snoop was in the center of it all, watching people pick up food, watching kids laugh, watching a neighborhood come back to life, someone tapped him on the shoulder. "You did a good thing," an old man said, nodding towards the garden. Snoop smiled. "Nah," he said. "We did it." Because this was no longer just his. He belonged to them. And I always would. Some ideas come and go, slipping through the mind like a passing breeze, but this one stuck. Snoop Dogg had spent his life moving forward, always thinking about the future, always building, always creating. But this was different. Because once he saw that empty land, once he saw the lost potential, the hunger, the need, he couldn't stop seeing it. The thought followed him. He was there when he got back in his car. He was there when he fell silent, looking out the window. It was there when she went to bed that night, her eyes wide, her heart restless. It was no longer a question. It was a mission. Snoop wasted no time. He didn't sit still with the idea, didn't wait for the right moment, didn't ask himself if it was worth doing. He just picked up the phone and started making calls. First, to the people who knew how to turn the earth into something real: gardeners, farmers, urban planners. People who had dedicated their lives to fighting food deserts in communities like this. Then to local businesses, to suppliers, to anyone who could donate land, tools, seeds. Anything that could turn this idea into reality. And when did they hear what I wanted to do? No one asked why. They just asked, when do we start? The next day, Snoop returned to the field. He didn't come alone. With him came landscapers, volunteers, people who had heard what was happening and just wanted to be a part of it. And while they were there, looking at the cracked pavement, the weeds, the rusty fence, someone asked, "Surely this can be a garden?" Snoop just smiled. Everything can grow if you give it the right conditions. And with that, they got to work. The first thing to go was the fence. For too long, I had kept people outside. I had turned this space into something enclosed, something useless. And when the last piece fell, when the last rusty post touched the ground, something changed. The land was no longer abandoned. He was no longer forgotten. It was open. And that's all. That was the first step. The ground was rough, hard, loaded with the weight of years of abandonment. But that didn't stop them. They worked, pulling weeds, digging the earth, breaking the concrete that had no reason to be there. It was an exhausting job, but no one complained. Because everyone knew that what they were building was not just a garden. It was a future. And you can't build a future without getting your hands dirty first. It took days before they could even think about planting. But when the first rows of soil were prepared, when the first seeds were carefully placed in the soil, it felt as if they were planting more than just crops. It felt like they were planting hope. Because, for the first time in a long time, people in the neighborhood weren't just watching something being taken from them. They were watching something grow. This wasn't just Snoop's project anymore. He belonged to the neighborhood. The parents came to help. The children arrived, excited, asking questions, learning how to plant their first seeds. The elders who had lived in this community for decades came to watch, offering advice, sharing stories of a time when things were different. And through it all, Snoop was there. Not just as the man who started it, but as someone who worked alongside them. At first, some people didn't think it would last. They had seen too many projects come and go, too many promises made and broken, too many things started with enthusiasm, only to fade into nothing. But this wasn't fading away. Because every day, the garden was growing. And every day, more people showed up. And one afternoon, when the first little green shoots peeked out of the ground, a woman who had lived in the neighborhood all her life whispered, "We did this." And for the first time, he believed it. The months passed. The first vegetables were ready to be harvested. Tomatoes, leafy vegetables, peppers, herbs, food grown by people, for people. And the first time a mother came and picked vegetables for her family, she cried. The first time a child pulled a carrot out of the ground and held it in his hands, he laughed as if he had discovered magic. And the first time an old man sat in the shade of a tree that was not there before, eating food that had come from the very earth that they once ignored, everyone knew this was more than a garden. It was a second chance. Snoop didn't put his name in the garden. He didn't turn it into a publicity stunt. He didn't make it about himself. Because this wasn't about a celebrity doing something nice. It was about showing what happens when people come together. To show that a vacant lot could become a place of life, of growth, of hope. And years later, when the trees were tall and the garden had fed hundreds, maybe thousands of people, they wouldn't just remember who started it. They would remember why it was started. Because once you show a community what's possible, they will never let it disappear. Some moments in life happen so quietly, so simply, that people don't realize they are witnessing history in the making. No cameras. No reporters. Just people, a piece of land, and a mission. The morning air was crisp, the sun still low in the sky, spreading golden rays over the forgotten terrain. But this was no longer an empty lot. Because today, he was becoming something more. Snoop Dogg stood at the edge of the field, looking at the people gathered, volunteers, families, old people, children, who still didn't fully understand what was going on, but who could sense that something important was about to start. And as he watched it all, as he saw shovels in the hands, dirt under the fingernails, and determination in the eyes of those who previously passed by this place without a second glance, he knew one thing for sure. This was the moment when everything changed. There is something powerful about the sound of the earth being shaken. It's more than just moving earth. It's more than just a shovel hitting the ground. It's a statement. A promise. And when that first shovel sank into the earth, it was as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. Because this wasn't just a plan anymore. This was happening. The first hole was dug. Then another one. And one more. And while the old, dry earth was turned upside down, while the weeds were uprooted, while the broken glass and years of neglect were removed, the earth began to breathe again. She wasn't just being cleaned up. He was being reborn. For years, the land had been surrounded by a rusty fence. A fence telling people they weren't welcome. A fence that made it clear that this space did not belong to them. A fence that had done nothing but keep people away from something that never really belonged to anyone in the first place. And that's why that fence had to go. Snoop watched as the first section was disassembled. Then another one. And one more. Until, finally, the last piece of rusted metal fell to the ground. And when the dust settled, the message became clear. This land no longer belonged to abandonment. It belonged to the people. Not everyone believed in this project when it started. Some watched him from their porches, arms folded, shaking their heads. Some muttered, "We've seen this before. It's not going to last." Some whispered, "It's a good idea, but ideas don't feed people." But day after day, as the garden began to take shape, as the earth went from being abandoned to being alive, as people kept showing up even when no one was looking, the skeptics began to believe. One by one, they started to get closer. First, just looking. Then, by asking questions. And finally, lifting shovels. Because it's one thing to doubt change when it's just words. But when you see it happening in front of your eyes, you can't help but want to be a part of it. The land was ready. The floor had been removed. The land had been cleared. The space had been prepared. And now it was time to plant. But this was not just about putting seeds in the ground. This was planting something that would last. Tomatoes, vegetables, peppers, herbs, fresh food in a place where fast food had been the only option for too long. Fruit trees that would yield nothing for years, but when they did, they would feed generations. Every seed that was buried in the ground was not just food. It was a promise. A promise that this garden was not temporary. A promise that those who planted today would eat from this land tomorrow. A promise that this neighborhood would never have to go without anything again. The months passed. The plants grew. The trees got taller. And one afternoon, when the first harvest of tomatoes ripened on the vine, when the first peppers were ready to be picked, when the garden that was once nothing suddenly overflowed with life. That was the moment when people knew. This was not just a project. This wasn't just a good idea. This was real. And when the first mother came and picked fresh vegetables for her family, she cried. Because for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to choose between cheap and healthy. For the first time in a long time, I had options. And that was everything. For the children, this was not just a garden. It was a park, a classroom, a new kind of home. They came every day, first just looking, then asking questions, then planting their own seeds. And the first time a child pulled a carrot out of the ground, held it in his hands, and realized that he had helped grow it, his smile said it all. Because food was no longer just something you bought in a store. It was something that was created. Something that was nourished. Something that was shared. And that lesson, it was worth more than any meal. It didn't happen overnight. But little by little, something changed. People began to gather in the garden. Neighbors who had never spoken before were now sharing meals together. The space that was once empty, useless, forgotten, became the heart of the neighborhood. And one afternoon, as Snoop was walking around the garden, watching families gather food, watching old people share stories, watching children plant seeds for the coming season, he realized something. This was no longer his. He belonged to them. And so it should be. Snoop Dogg didn't put his name in the garden. She didn't make it about him. He didn't turn it into a celebrity project. Because this wasn't about him. It was about what happens when a community takes control of its future. Of what happens when people come together and decide they deserve more. And years later, when the trees were tall and the garden had fed hundreds, maybe thousands of people, they wouldn't just remember who started it. They would remember why it was started. Because once a community realizes what is possible, he never lets it go away. One afternoon, long after the first crops had grown, long after the first harvest had been shared, long after the first seed had become a real thing, Snoop walked through the garden alone. I didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to advertise. He didn't need to take the credit. He just walked around, watching as a once struggling neighborhood now thrived. And while he was there, taking it all in, an old man sitting on a bench smiled at him and nodded. "You did a good thing," the man said. Snoop smiled back. "Nah," he said. "We did it." And with that, she turned and walked away, knowing that no matter where she went, this garden, this place, this legacy, would continue to grow. Because now, it belonged to the people. And I always would. The sun was shining high, illuminating something that was once nothing, a place of weeds, cracked pavement, and broken fences. But today he was alive. The air smelled different now, fresh, earthy, infused with the scent of things growing where they were never supposed to grow. The garden had become a jungle of green, rows of tomatoes bursting with color, leafy vegetables moving in the breeze, fruit trees upright, promising something even bigger in the coming seasons. People gathered, not just to look, but to touch, to pick up, to feel the weight of something real in their hands. Mothers who had spent years stretching every dollar now held fresh vegetables grown right here, for free. Children, their eyes wide with wonder, were running between the rows of plants, their hands brushing the leaves, their fingers sinking into the soil they had helped to cultivate. It was the first time many of them had seen food that wasn't wrapped in plastic, that wasn't stacked on shelves under fluorescent lights, but growing, alive, thriving. And when the first mother bent down, plucked a ripe tomato from the vine, and held it in her hands, she cried. Because for the first time in years, she didn't have to choose between feeding her family and paying her bills. For the first time in years, he had something that was his. That night, something magical happened. The food wasn't just harvested. It was shared. Neighbors who had never spoken before gathered, bringing baskets of vegetables, handfuls of peppers, tomatoes, so fresh that they still smelled of the sun. Families sat at picnic tables, old people told stories while chopping vegetables, children ran around, laughing, with their pockets full of herbs that they had been told they could take home. Someone brought a pot. Someone else brought rice. And when the first meal was cooked over an open flame, the garden became more than just a place to grow food. It became a place to gather. It became a place where no one had to eat alone. And when Snoop arrived, watching the scene unfold, he knew this was bigger than he had ever imagined. At first, people thought it wouldn't last. They'd seen things like this before, good ideas that came and went, promises that started off strong but faded away when the cameras disappeared. But this was not just a project. It wasn't just a place to grow food. It was a movement. People showed up every day. Mothers who had never had time for gardening now spent their mornings tending to the plants. Old people who used to watch from their porches now taught children to take care of the earth. Teenagers who used to spend their afternoons on the streets now spent them here, learning, building, growing up. And little by little, the garden became something bigger than anyone had expected. It became a heartbeat, a rhythm, a symbol of what could happen when a community decided to take care of itself. And no one, not even Snoop, was prepared for how much everything would change. Most of the places had schedules. Shops were opening and closing. Businesses operated on a schedule. But the garden was always open. It didn't matter if it was morning, afternoon, or after the sun had set, people were coming. Some were coming to pick up food. Some came just to sit, to breathe, to exist in a place that had been created for them. Some came just to be a part of something. And that was the real beauty of it all. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about belonging. The garden had started as a neighborhood thing, a quiet transformation, a local movement. But something so real, something so powerful, it was only a matter of time before the world found out. The news spread. People were talking. And then, one day, the media came. They wanted to know how it happened. They wanted to know who started it. They wanted to put a name to it, make it a headline. And when Snoop Dogg was asked about it, he just smiled. "This is not about me," he said. "It's about them." Because this was no longer his. It belonged to the people. It started as a simple idea, growing food, feeding people. But one day, something amazing happened. The garden produced so much that there was more food than the neighborhood could consume. So, instead of letting it go to waste, they did something unthinkable. They gave it away. Baskets of fresh produce were loaded onto trucks. Boxes of vegetables, herbs, and fruits were delivered to food banks, shelters, schools, and homes where it was needed most. And for the first time, the garden's impact extended beyond the neighborhood. This place wasn't just feeding families anymore. He was feeding an entire city. It wasn't just the adults who saw the garden for what it really was. Teachers started taking students to visit him, children who had never seen food grow in real soil, who had never planted a seed, who had never known that fresh food could be more than something wrapped in plastic in the store. They watched as little hands dug into the earth, while amazed eyes lit up as the buds started to grow. As young minds understood, food was not just something you buy. It was something that is created, and that was the kind of education that lasted forever. One garden was not enough. Not anymore. The impact was too great, the need too strong. And then, people started asking, why stop here? Other neighborhoods wanted their own gardens. Other communities wanted the same opportunity to grow, to build, to recover their spaces. And snow. I wasn't about to say no. So the movement grew. One garden became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became 10. And suddenly, something that started as an empty plot of land in a forgotten neighborhood was changing lives all over the city. Snoop didn't want the garden to be just something for the present. I wanted it to last forever. So he made sure that was the case. He helped set up financing. He put the power in the hands of the people who had built it. And when he took his last walk around the original garden, watching families pick fresh food, watching the elderly sit in the shade, watching the children laugh and plant their own seeds, he knew. This was not temporary. This was legacy. One afternoon, as the sun was setting over the garden, Snoop stood quietly in the doorway. He had done a lot of things in his life. He sold millions of records. He performed in front of massive crowds. He traveled the world. But this was one of the biggest things I had ever been a part of. And when an old man sitting on a bench nodded towards him and said, "You did a good thing, son," Snoop just smiled. "Nah," he said. "We did it." Then, with one last look at the garden, the people, the life that had grown out of nothing, she walked away, knowing that no matter where she went, this place would keep growing. Because now it belonged to the people. And I always would. The garden was no longer just a place where food grew. It had become something much bigger. People didn't just come to pick vegetables, they came to be part of something, to meet their neighbors, to share stories, to build a future together. What started as a forgotten piece of land was now the beating heart of the community. One afternoon, an old woman sat under a fruit tree that had been planted months ago, watching the children laugh as they harvested vegetables. She smiled and whispered, "This is how it should have always been." And at that moment, everyone knew, this garden was no longer just about food. It was about belonging. Other neighborhoods wanted the same thing. People who previously felt powerless realized that they could build something lasting. New gardens began to appear on abandoned land, behind schools, next to churches. Each one was a reminder that change was not only possible, it was happening. And Snoop, he didn't need any recognition. He didn't need a name badge. Because every time a mother picked fresh vegetables for her family, every time a child planted a seed and watched it grow, every time a community came together to build something real, that was his legacy. Snoop Dogg had spent his life making history. But this was one of the biggest things I had ever been a part of. Because food wasn't just about hunger. Gardens weren't just about plants. And a community wasn't just about where people lived, it was about what they built together. And as long as this garden existed, as long as fresh food grew where there was nothing before, as long as people remembered that they had the power to change their own world, this story would never end.